Marcus unfolded the scrap of paper on his passenger seat. "Do not stop," like an order meant for him alone. Rain stitched the windshield into silver bars. The city breathed in a slow, tired rhythm. A cruiser slid into the lane behind him, its light a thin blue blade, and a voice on the radio said his name like an indictment. He kept his badge hidden and his hands visible. Every small move felt priced in fear and consequence. Someone had already told a story about him, someone who wanted that story to stick. By morning, the cameras would show the scene. By then, truth would need witnesses he wasn't sure he had. Before we go any further, if this is your first time watching one of our videos, we'd love for you to hit that subscribe button. Your support means the world to us, and it helps us bring you even more powerful stories. Stick with us till the very end. And if the story moves you, drop your thoughts in the comments and share it with a friend. Now let's begin. The note felt like a small heat in Marcus's hand, as if paper could hold a heartbeat. He smoothed the crease with a thumb and read the two words again. "Do not stop." The words were written in a hurried, cramped hand. No signature, no explanation. Tucked beneath his phone on the passenger seat of the Tesla. Outside, the city's evening rain stitched silver threads across the windshield. The cabin smelled of warm leather and the faint citrus of an air freshener he'd promised himself he'd replace. Marcus let the engine idle, though the car could have driven itself, and listened to the rain count off the seconds of a life that had lately felt measured in small, cautious beats. Across the lane, sodium streetlights threw bars of tired orange over the wet pavement. Buildings leaned into each other like people sharing warmth against the cold. Traffic moved with polite impatience. Headlights winked, tires hissed, while someone weeks earlier had written a complaint about a neighbor's late-night music, and the paper had become a legal weight. The city did not notice Marcus specifically. It barely noticed itself. It was a place that swallowed detail and kept its faces smooth and forgetful. Tonight, it will be one more evening in a long line of evenings. That was the way of cities, indifferent, efficient, and hungry. Marcus rolled the note into his palm and felt the scar under his wedding band. He had not always known how to measure risk. Once, risk had been a fast thing, an argument, a sprint down a hallway, a decision that changed the shape of a future in the time it took to catch a breath. Now risk was slow and layered. The polite smile at a gas station, the extra beat at a crosswalk when a police cruiser passed, the way people refold the world around him when they noticed the color of his skin. He thought of the badge tucked under his jacket, flat and unassuming, a rectangle of authority and possibility. He thought of the lives that had been handed over to him and how fragile that handing could be when someone misread the shape of one man behind the wheel. An impartial clock would say it was 9:17 p.m. A camera fixed on the intersection would record the exact sequence of lights. Marcus's Tesla registered a low battery warning in the corner of the dash, the electric car's gentle hum like a contained promise. On the curb, a newspaper stand advertised a headline in block letters about local budgets, nothing about him, nothing about the nameless note. People came and went in the footage of the city, small moving shapes with umbrellas. None of them could yet know the meaning of the paper in Marcus's hand. None of them could know the way his jaw tightened when a cruiser rolled slowly by. Lights off, windows up. To an observer with no heartbeat, it was simply a man waiting in a car on a rainy night. He rubbed his eyes, the tiny habitual gesture of a man who had learned to sleep in 2-hour segments between calls and the pull of a conscience that never fully rested. There were more layers than the badge and the car. A daughter's laugh recorded on a sleepy afternoon, a mother's cautious pride on a call that lasted 10 seconds, a line of colleagues who evaluated him by quiet measures. Marcus let his fingers trace the seam of the steering wheel, thinking of how often he had been mistaken for someone else and how seldom those mistakes ended well. That thought was a small stone he carried in his pocket. He had grown used to feeling its weight. Rain drummed a steady counterpoint on the roof. The city's smells altered with a storm. Hot asphalt and wet wool, a faint perfume of someone passing with an umbrella. The Tesla's interior lights softened the angles of Marcus's face. throwing shadows that made his cheekbones look like places carved by decisions. He was 38, not old in the way time sometimes bruises people, but seasoned. Years in the field had taught him to read a pause in a sentence like it was a sentence itself. Training had given him protocols, but life had given him the language of doubt. The note on the seat was the kind of voice that required action without asking for consent. Urgent, naked, a riddle. A pedestrian with a hood walked past, the hood a small island of privacy. Cameras above the intersection blinked, and a traffic light changed from red to green with a clinical obedientness that never wondered what it meant to stop or to go. The city system's lights, signs, cameras functioned with a blunt, neutral certainty. Marcus's life, partially public and partially hidden, sat at the junction of those systems. The badge under his jacket was a passport of truth in some rooms and a label of suspicion in others. Neutral observers could record his route and the colors of the sky that night, but they could not see the way his hands trembled just enough to betray a tiredness only he knew. He placed the note on the dash where the streetlight would pick it out like a pale island. He thought of another letter he'd received months ago, a polite invitation that had turned out to be a setup. He thought about how a career built on secrecy meant that strangers often made him a story in their heads long before he ever spoke. The island of paper seemed to pulse with the city's light. Marcus breathed once in a slow economy of air and drove. He did not know yet that the driver would stop him on the side of the road, that someone with a uniform would speak words that would make the rain sound different, that a misread uniform could change the laws of his small, private world. Outside, the rain kept threading the windshield, patient as fate. The car's engine, more whisper than growl, cut through the hush. Marcus set his jaw with a practiced calm and merged into the stream of cars, carrying his secret in the pocket of his coat and the note, like a small, dangerous compass. The first light that did not belong to the city was a thin blue strip cutting through the rain like a blade. It came up in Marcus's rear view before he registered its source, a cruiser easing into the lane behind him, lights off at first, then ghosting into life as if someone had blinked awake. The car's soft glow painted his passenger window the color of a bruise. Marcus felt the way a swimmer feels the current before it takes hold. Small, inevitable, a rearrangement of balance. An empathetic voice. Marcus's chest tightened the way it always did when authority approached, old reflexes from years when his own badge had been a shield and a question at once. He kept his hands on the wheel where they could be seen, palms steady, thumbs loose. He wanted to be calm because calm cost less than panic. He thought of Lena at home, sleeping unaware, of his mother's voice, careful with pride. He breathed slowly, in a rhythm that had saved him before. An impartial observer would note that at 9:34 p.m., the cruiser, Unit 412, fell into the stream of traffic behind a black Tesla, and that the gap between them closed with the indifferent precision of machines. The cruiser's radio murmured static, and a dispatcher's clipped tones. A camera fixed on the light pole recorded the movement without judgment. 2 cars, rain, 3 figures moving through a small slice of a city's night. License and registration came the first human sound that did more than record. It was from a uniformed man who stepped from the cruiser with a slow, measured movement. He wore authority like armor, stiff shoulders, a face set to a habitual readiness. His name was Daniel Price. To some, he was just Officer Price. To others, he was a man who had learned to keep his hands at the edge of things. To Marcus, in that instant, he was a stranger with a predisposition. Marcus lowered his window enough to keep the rain from slicing across the dash. The smell of wet wool and metal entered the car. Daniel's voice was flat, official, the kind that filled spaces with expectation. The conversation started as the script of routine stops. "Evening, sir. Do you know why I stopped you?" The question was simple. The undercurrent was not. Marcus answered with a practiced calm, the voice of a man trained to speak, with enough deference to avoid escalation and enough firmness to keep truth intact. He gave his name, Marcus Hale, and held the deed to his privacy just out of reach. The badge stayed under his jacket, the credentials only sliding into light if the moment required it. He had not expected this stop to require that reveal. He had expected, for once, a normal drive home. But Daniel's eyes did not rest on his hands or the steering wheel. They found the color of his skin like a question. Small things shifted. Daniel's tone tightened, the pause in his speech lengthened into a wait. "Step out of the vehicle," he said, and the sentence landed like a small hammer. Marcus obliged slowly. He stepped out, so his movements would not be read as threatening. The rain struck his shoulders in little, urgent taps. Conversations in the city's periphery unfolded. A dog barked, a bus hissed to a stop, a couple under an umbrella passed without looking. None of them knew the undercurrents in that vignette. That a single command and a single response could tilt a life. The dispatcher's voice came again over Daniel's shoulder, low and perfunctory. "Multiple calls," she said. "Report of a suspicious vehicle, matching plate, possible theft." The words were thin paper over the night, but they flexed into something more dangerous. Daniel's jaw worked. Marcus watched for the man's hands, the way they occupied space when a person was ready to act. A tremor of dread passed through Marcus, not for himself first, but for the ripple his detainment could cause for Lena and his mother. He folded memory into strategy. Call a number, tell a voice, create a record. He thought of files in a drawer, of cases that had turned on details and witnesses. He thought of how easy it could be for a small falsehood to become a bedrock of accusation. The empathetic narrator leaned close to his chest. Marcus felt the old ache of being seen as a story before the facts arrived. He had been in rooms where the wrong assumptions had been the loudest voice. He had a life built quietly on two truths. He fought for justice, and he lived with the knowledge that the world did not always recognize that fight in him. The badge under his jacket was a secret that protected him in some rooms and provoked suspicion in others. From the corner of the intersection, headlights carved arcs into the rain. A man on the sidewalk, thin, eager, watched with the fixed interest of someone who wanted a spectacle to season his evening. The city liked small dramas. It collected them and forwarded them by gossip and social feed. If someone else's story could be made louder, it would be. The stop was no longer only routine. It had been seeded with other hands. When Daniel asked whether Marcus had anything in the vehicle that could be considered contraband, the word contraband hung in the cold night like a noose. Marcus kept his voice even. He offered to cooperate, to show paperwork, to call his supervisor. Daniel's reply carried something that was not in protocol, a half-smile that did not reach his eyes, a taste of private certainty. "We get a lot of calls," Daniel said. "People see things. You understand." That small, casual phrase, "we get a lot of calls," was the seed the narrative would return to. It suggested an ecosystem of reports, of neighbors and bystanders and motives wrapped in petty grievances. It suggested that someone had chosen to tell a story about Marcus before he had the chance to tell his own. It hinted at what might be a betrayal, a voice from Marcus's world, or from nowhere, tilting the system against him. As Daniel reached for his handcuffs, not yet for restraint, but for the sign of preparedness, Marcus's mind ran quick and cold. He felt a sense of being rearranged, not by force, but by meaning. The stop would not simply be a night's annoyance. It would be a hinge. The city, impartial and bustling, continued its small noises. Rain, engines, the distant closing of doors. But something had begun to move that, once started, would not go back to sleep. An impartial recorder would list the facts plainly. Two men under a streetlight, rain running off the brim of a cruiser cap, a Tesla's door still damp, where Marcus had closed it. But the story between those facts lived in the small, human places a logbook never reaches, on the thin line between what people show and what they hide. Marcus felt like a man standing in a mirror that only reflected half his face. Up close, he was careful, trained, precise. Farther out, he was the color people read first. He introduced himself again, Marcus Hale, sir, because names were small anchors in a sea of assumptions. Daniel Price said his own name like a shield and a question at once. Officer Price, he added, then asked the usual questions that had become rituals to him. where he worked, why he was out late, if he had anyone to call. The questions were neutral, the pauses were not. Marcus's chest held a quiet history. He had joined the DEA after years in local departments because he felt he could do more, pull more threads, answer more calls that Americans did not want to hear. His work required absolute calm under small storms. It taught him to speak slowly so others would believe. He thought of Lena at the kitchen table with an unfinished crossword, of Margaret, his mother, who still kept his old school picture in a frame. He did not wear his DEA credentials plainly. In nights like this, a badge could complicate more than it cleared. He wanted the stop to end without spectacle, without the gossip that turned neighborhoods into judges. Daniel's jaw clenched, sometimes the way a man's did when a story about him did not match the story he told himself. He had been a patrol officer for years. He had learned to read trouble in the way someone read the weather. Daniel had his own small battles, promotions delayed, respect withheld, the quiet idea that the world had moved while he stood policing its edges. He believed in the shape of law as he had been taught it, but he also trusted the quick certainty of tips and calls. To him, a report from a neighbor meant he should act. In his head, action was proof of purpose. "Do you work late often?" Daniel asked, not unkindly, but with a tightness there. It was the kind of question that wanted a simple answer and refused to accept nuance. Sometimes, Marcus said, he kept his voice even, letting the words be like a calm tide. "Long days. Family stuff. I'm heading home." The empathetic voice noticed the way Marcus's hand moved, steady, not hiding, but careful enough to be read as non-threatening. It noted how he kept his badge folded away, how he preferred to choose the moment to reveal his life. He wanted to protect Lena from the noise that followed him. He wanted to keep Margaret's pride from being complicated by public scenes. There were cases where a reveal of his DEA status resolved things. There were nights when it would do the opposite. Daniel watched Marcus the way a man watches for a pattern in the clouds. He listened to the cadence of Marcus's speech and the choice of his words. There was something in Daniel's face, an impatience that had been hardened into suspicion. "We had calls about a suspicious vehicle," he said again. "Matching plate to a report." The report hung between them like a mirror that showed only one angle. Marcus felt the history of 100 stops pulse like an old bruise. He remembered times when the tone of a voice had shortened a life's margin for error. He thought for a heartbeat of taking his badge out then, slapping it down, and saying, "I am not what you think." But he pictured Lena's face private and small in the dark, and he chose to manage the moment instead. "I can show you my ID," he said slowly. It was an offer measured in protection and risk, proof that could end this, and also proof that might inflame it. Daniel hesitated. His training told him to accept cooperation and move on. His suspicion told him to verify. The conflict in him was quiet, but fierce, a man who wanted recognition for vigilance and feared being told he had overreacted. That fear tasted, in his private moments, like humiliation. When someone else, an anonymous voice, called in and painted a picture of Marcus as a threat, Daniel had been granted a permission his own doubts would not otherwise have given him. In the dim light, a shadow of something like pity flickered across Daniel's face, then hardened. "Step back," he said, and not as politely as before. He was preparing for what could be wrong, rehearsing the worst-case scenario like a man who feared surprise more than he feared guilt. The empathetic narrator felt Marcus's disappointed steadiness. "I understand," he said aloud. He put his hands where Daniel could see them, and the rain clapped against the roof like a small insistence. Marcus thought of the agency's code, the quiet rules about when to identify and when to keep things private. There were files he could open, colleagues who would answer a midnight call, but every reveal had its cost. Between them, the air held stories. There were echoes of other lives. Lena worrying by the phone at home, Margaret praying with an old hymn, Daniel replaying reports in his kitchen, seeking proof that his night's work mattered. Conversations that would happen later, calls to supervisors, quick texts sent in panic, were not yet made, but the shape of them could be guessed like footprints in the rain. A small twist threaded through the exchange. As Daniel stepped forward to radio for a plate check, his fingers brushed the edge of a photograph tucked in his wallet. It was a cheap snapshot of him with other officers' smiles frozen like medals. He looked at it briefly, the kind of human gesture that revealed more than any badge. For Daniel, those men were proof he belonged somewhere. For Marcus, that small picture suggested that rules and loyalty had lines no one told him about. Neither man could see the other completely. Each held a private map of motives, Marcus with the complicated atlas of a DEA agent who lived in two worlds, Daniel with the narrow chart of a patrolman who needed confirmation. They both wanted the same thing in their different languages, to be right, to be safe, to be seen. Between those wants the night folded tighter, and the next moves, when they came, would press harder than any of them could yet know. The radio static was a thin, ordinary thing, white noise that belonged to every night on the beat. Then a voice cut through it, flat and official, but carrying a name that made Marcus's chest shudder like glass struck by a pebble. Unit 412, this is Agent Paul Turner, DEA. We have a tip on Hale. Plate matches a surveillance tag. Proceed and detain for questioning. The voice was calm, practiced. It came over the same line that had hummed dispatch earlier, but now it carried authorization and a certainty Marcus had not expected. An impartial recorder would mark the sequence plainly. At 9:42 p.m., a federal agent identified himself over the police channel and requested local assistance. The cruiser's lights flashed a measure faster. Daniel's shoulders tightened. His jaw set into the angle of someone who welcomed order more than ambiguity. He reached for his radio like a man taking up a familiar tool. Marcus felt something cold and personal unspool in his chest. Paul Turner. He knew the name the way you know the stamp of a colleague's handwriting. Turner had been on the task force with him months ago, the one Marcus trusted on the rare late-night stakeouts when exhaustion made memory soft. They had bickered about procedures and shared bad coffee. They had been professional enough to blur into the sameness of colleagues. Marcus had never imagined Turner would choose him for the kind of order that ended with cuffs. The empathetic voice leaned, so close it could have named the ache. Betrayal has a texture, like salt on skin. Marcus tasted it instantly, sharp, unwanted. It did not come with a shout or dramatized collapse. It arrived in the clinical line of a radio call and in Daniel's eyes, which moved from procedure to the private satisfaction of being confirmed. Marcus heard the syllables of his own name as if they had become evidence of guilt. Turner, Marcus said without meaning to. The word escaped as a question because his mind scrambled for mistakes. Maybe the voice had been misheard. Maybe an agent with the same name, a different office. But the radio repeated the confirmation, Agent Turner. We're coordinating with local units. Hale is on a federal watch list for a case we're running. Daniel's partner, a younger cop who had been quiet until then, stepped forward, hand hovering over a scanner. He held a printed sheet now, passed up from the cruiser, a photocopied photo of Marcus taken from a surveillance still, clipped with a note, federal source. The paper's edges were jagged where it had been torn from a file. The world is reduced to black and white and a typed line of accusation. Marcus felt his own hands go numb where they rested at his sides. He thought of the badge beneath his jacket, the file folders he kept locked, the quiet agreements that had allowed him to move in both federal and local worlds. He had been careful. Secrecy was the language of his work. And yet, the betrayal that unspooled was not careful. Someone inside the circle had thrown him into the light. Daniel's face was a map of small satisfactions. Agent Turner identified you to us, he said, as if he were reading from a ledger. You're coming with us for questioning, Mr. Hale. We'll sort it all out at the station. His voice left no room for nuance. His posture assumed truth had already been declared. Marcus's mind leapt for explanations that would hold. Perhaps Turner was running a cross-check and had genuinely identified Marcus as someone they needed to talk to. There were times when federal coordination was clumsy and necessary. Perhaps it was a mistake, an error in names. He opened his mouth to ask for a call to his supervisor for a phone number to confirm, for the procedural patience the badge under his jacket entitled him to. The empathy in him wanted to reach across the moment and name the human error. But when he glanced at the printed sheet, something else hit him. In the margin of the photocopy, in the same hurried scrawl he'd seen before on the anonymous note, were two words: "Do not stop." The sight punched a hole through any explanation that would make sense. The note on his passenger seat, the one he had read like a heartbeat, matched the handwriting on the evidence someone had planted in the file. Small things looped together like the teeth of a trap. An impartial observer would note the facts. A federal agent's voice authorized the stop. Local police followed protocol. Marcus was now the subject of a watch list notice. But the empathetic voice found the shape of the wound. This was not a bureaucratic misstep. It smelled of design, a careful hand pulling strings to make a man appear where he would be most vulnerable. Marcus's throat closed around a new fear. This was not only about being detained. If Turner had placed his name on a federal watch and then called it into local units, the implications were vast. The ring of trust that had permitted Marcus to live between jurisdictions had been punctured. Someone had used the language of his own world to mark him as suspect. He looked up at Daniel. "Why Turner?" Marcus managed, the word small but sharp. "Why would he? What is this about?" Daniel glanced at the photocopy again, then at the cruiser where the dispatcher was already typing something into a console. "You're part of a case, Mr. Hale," he said. Agent Turner said he needed you detained for questioning related to an internal investigation. There was a cold efficiency to the words that made Marcus feel ancient and naive all at once. The narrator's two voices merged for a second, impartial about the actions, empathetic about the cost. Marcus had been sure of his world only so long as he could rely on the people inside it. Now, one of those people had transformed into the source of his undoing. It raised a suspicion that would not be easy to set down. If an agent could weaponize coordination, could colleagues be trusted at all? If Turner had reasons, fear of exposure, appetite for power, petty revenge, then the danger was not merely procedural. It was intimate. Even as Daniel readied the next steps, Marcus's mind churned with the first, desperate calculations of a man betrayed. Memories of a raid that had gone wrong, of a promotion missed, of quiet competition at briefings. He could imagine grudges small as office coffee and broad as criminal complicity. He could imagine Turner standing behind a radio saying his name with that flat certitude. Outside, the rain blurred the street into a smear of silver. A car passed, indifferent. In the back of Marcus's throat, the note's faded ink seemed to burn with meaning. This stop was not an isolated event. It was a deliberate hinge. The first twist had turned the world Marcus thought he knew inside out. Now he had to decide how to move when the wrong people already held the map. The handcuffs were colder than Marcus had expected. Metal kissed his skin and left a halo of chill that spread into a deeper, slower kind of cold. Someone clicked the cuffs closed with a professional motion, the sound tiny and decisive in the rain-muted air. Marcus felt the press of fabric at his wrists and the odd intimacy of being immobilized where the world could study him. It was not violence. It was a protocol that carried the authority of law and the humiliation of being stopped in motion. An impartial voice would list the motions. Marcus was guided into the cruiser, asked the standard questions, and read his rights in measured tones. A search of the vehicle followed, officers splitting the Tesla into rectangles of suspicion, glove compartments, the trunk beneath floor mats. The car's smooth internals, the soft hum of battery systems, seemed to accuse him by contrast. Orderly, clean, precise. Paperwork was filled out with clipped handwriting. A notepad captured license numbers and timestamps. Cameras above folded the scene into an efficient file. The empathetic voice lingered on smaller things. Lena's name was in the back of Marcus's throat like a prayer. He thought of her hands, the small habit she had of tucking a strand of hair behind her ear when she worried. He imagined her standing at their kitchen window, watching the phone like someone waiting for the weather to change. He thought of Margaret, who liked the house in the bright morning and called in the same sing-song on Sundays. Those faces shifted the way a compass shifts in a magnetic field. His choices now would tilt lives beyond the immediate geometry of cuffs and files. Inside the cruiser, plastic under his knees smelled faintly of disinfectant. Daniel rode in front, partner silent in the driver's seat, Both men wearing expressions that suggested the night's work had a moral clarity to them. Marcus kept quiet because words could be a rope that pulled tighter. He could say the truth that he worked federal cases, that the badge under his jacket could prove it, and watch the scene rearrange itself. Or he could hold his secret close and trust process to untangle the web. Each option bore danger. The first dilemma pressed like a thumb into his ribs: reveal his DEA status and invite an ugly public unraveling, or stay silent and hope the paperwork, the radios, the slow machinery of law would correct itself. Revealing the badge would make the conversation federal, possibly exposing ongoing operations and informants. It could harm colleagues, ruin investigations, and put others at risk. Silence might make him look like an ordinary criminal, like the man in the photocopy. It might allow the machinery to run its course and produce a slower justice, if justice still moved that night. He chose the middle movement at first. Cooperate, ask for a supervisor, request a call. Daniel listened with the patient impatience of someone who had been taught to expect cooperation, but did not yet trust it fully. "We've notified the feds," he said. "They'll handle verification." The words were meant to reassure and to put the matter in other hands. Marcus heard them as a delay that could either save him or bury him. An external pressure arrived in the form of a knock on Daniel's cruiser roof, someone at the scene with a camera phone, a light that flared like a small sun. A bystander had started to stream, the city's appetite for spectacle finding new fuel. The bright square of a screen turned the private mechanics of arrest into a theater. The image of Marcus in cuffs under the rain would travel away from the street and into feeds, where headlines were hungry and nuance rarely survived. Marcus felt the swell of something he had feared for years, his life becoming an image people made quick judgments from. The young partner stepped away to speak with the onlooker, and Daniel's attention flicked, just enough for a small crisis to bloom. "You need to tell me everything," he said, voice lower. It was a demand for honesty and a test for trust. Marcus considered a lie that would ease the moment, a falsehood that might unstick the night's machinery. But lies tasted like gravel in his mouth. He told the truth, that he was DEA, that he had colleagues who could confirm him, that Agent Turner had called him in. He watched Daniel's face for the trace of a new calculation, validation, or doubt. Daniel's eyes hardened around the edges, not with cruelty, but with the wary caution of someone learning that processes could be manipulated. He called it in again, a second confirmation request to dispatch, and then strode back to the cruiser to speak with a sergeant who had arrived, summoned by routine or by the onlookers streaming. Marcus felt the minutes become a column of pressure: administrative steps, checks, radio chatter. Each step was slow, bureaucratic, necessary, and every second was a place for someone else to act. The second dilemma arrived like a shadow at the edge of a door. If Turner had orchestrated this, why? Jealousy? Professional rivalry? Was it profit, fear of exposure, or a scapegoat crafted to hide something worse? Marcus's mind flitted through scenarios with the speed of a man who had built strategies for danger, enemies he had made in past raids, people whose businesses he had upended, a mole who needed a scapegoat. If Turner had motives tied to money or power, the stakes were larger than a roadside stop. If it was personal, a grudge, then Marcus was a face to satisfy a quiet hunger for payback. The empathetic narrator felt Marcus's anger press against the cuff's cold ring. It was an anger sharpened by a sense of betrayal deeper than policy. He had trusted Turner once. He had shared cramped cars and late cafes, had argued about warrants and tactics, and had relied on his word in rooms where silence carried consequences. Now, a voice that once belonged to a colleague had been turned into the instrument of his exposure. In the station's fluorescent lights, procedures would be clinical and grinding. But here, under the rain and the streetlight, human calculations still mattered. A supervisor's arrival, a phone call, a name verified, any of these could tilt the balance. Marcus weighed the options. Call Lena and risk worrying her. Call his supervisor and risk exposing the investigation. Stay silent and let the system crawl toward truth. Each choice would condemn him to a future shaped by other people's decisions. He closed his eyes for a heartbeat and felt his training fold into his bones. observe, document, control the variables you can. He asked for a phone call to his supervisor and for a list of witnesses present. He took the notepad handed to him and wrote down the names of officers, the time, the weather, an inventory of truth that could be useful later. It was small warfare, paper against memory, but in the cold, small things mattered. The cruiser's engine idled, and Daniel returned with a look that had less certainty than before. The first set of checks had not yet been cleared. Marcus breathed, the taste of metal at the back of his throat. The night had become a test of alliances, and as the rain kept falling, he understood that the map of friends and enemies had shifted. He could feel the first edges of a larger storm gathering, one that would pull into daylight and demand answers no one could give beneath a streetlight. The precinct smelled like bleach and old coffee, the kind of clean that pretended to hide hours of waiting. Fluorescent lights hummed in a flat, patient note above metal benches. Cameras blinked red like small, impartial eyes. Marcus sat cuffed at a table, the metal cool against his wrists, while rain still ran in tapes across his jacket where it had clung and dried. Around him, paperwork made a slow, bureaucratic river. Voices rose and fell like distant tides. An impartial voice would record the arrivals. Sergeant Robert Collins, efficient and official. Agent Laura Bennett from DEA, clipped and professional. Daniel pacing at the edge of the room with the posture of a man who had spent the night proving his vigilance. Agent Paul Turner entered last, shoulders tight, a smile that had been practiced to sit in the right place. He moved like someone used to having his version of the world accepted without question. The empathetic voice peered inside Marcus's chest. Betrayal had a sound like paper tearing very near the ear, and Marcus felt it still. He watched Turner as if the man were a map he could not yet read. The note, "Do not stop," seemed to thrum against the inside of his skull. His fingers itched to reach for the badge beneath his shirt to toss it on the table and end the charade with a single, clean truth. But he had learned that truth could be messy. Sometimes honesty exposed others in ways that cost lives. Agent Bennett moved with a particular economy. She did not like surprises. She checked IDs, asked for logs, and when Daniel explained the radio call, she folded her lips into a line and walked to the dispatch terminal. The impartial recorder would have shown her actions as simple procedure. The empathetic voice noticed the way her jaw tightened when the logs did not match the call. The radio entry showed an origin different from the official federal communication channels, a burner line flagged for irregular use. Who had access to that line? Bennett asked, voice low. Daniel shifted, and a ripple passed across his face. Ethan Reed, Daniel's younger partner, had been quiet all night, but fingers never really stopped looking for things. He nudged a monitor, pulled up the street camera footage, and then something else. The bystanders' stream from earlier. The playback blinked, pixelated at first, then came clear. Rain headlights, Marcus's silhouette getting out of the car. For a beat, the scene lived only as ordinary motion. Then the frame widened and revealed a shape approaching the passenger side. Paul Turner's profile sliding into the stream like a dark promise. Turner's hand touched the dash. He seemed to be looking for something. The camera stuttered, but the sequence was there. Marcus felt the air in the room change. The impartial cameras had recorded what human memory had not, a federal agent on the street, near his car, before the call. Ethan rewound gently, lips moving. Turner had been on the scene earlier than he admitted. The stream showed him handing a photocopied photo to someone who looked like an ordinary citizen. The same citizen later made the suspicious vehicle call. It was obvious in the certain, terrible way that facts become, once aligned. Turner's smile thinned. He stammered a reason, plausible confusion about coordination, a claim that he'd been double-checking surveillance. But the footage was a small, cold mirror. Agent Bennett slid the log across the table. The burner number had been traced to a pay-for-use kiosk outside a diner near the river. One that a security camera placed Turner at 15 minutes earlier, exchanging what looked like a folded bill with a man whose face Marcus knew only from names in case files. The man had been on the lists Marcus kept, a local distributor who'd escaped a roundup months before. The room became a stage of small combustions. Daniel's shoulders went rigid, anger flared like a match. Ethan's hands found the radio recording, the one with Turner's voice. On the playback, the tone that had once sounded federal and clean carried. Beneath it, the echo of a second line, one that matched the payphone chatter and the distributor's number. It was an ugly knot of collusion, of favors traded for silence. The empathetic voice watched Marcus gather himself. The betrayal cut deep because it came from where trust once lived. He had argued cases with Turner, listened to his jokes when the night was cold, idled with him in cars that smelled of bad coffee and tired jokes. To learn that Turner had traded his authority for a scapegoat, used Marcus's name to shield a criminal while framing a colleague, felt like someone stealing the very ground beneath his feet. Why? Marcus asked at last, not a demand for procedure, but a human plea. The question carried a speed that made Turner falter. He had counted on procedure to bury nuance. Now the procedure unearthed him. Turner's answer came out small and ragged. Money, he said. A promise of silence in exchange for turning the heat away from someone the agency had failed to hold. A petty, personal bite of revenge because Marcus had once recommended a transfer that had cost Turner a promotion. Human reasons, cheap and ordinary, that bloomed into corruption when given power. Daniel stepped forward, voice thick. You used the system to frame a colleague. The accusation landed like a stone in a still pool. Around them, the precinct's hum fell to a hush. Turner reached for excuses, protocol confusions, miscommunications, but the footage and the logs were the sort of language that people could not rewrite. Sergeant Collins moved with the dry efficiency of someone who had seen enough to know when an explanation was a way to hide guilt. He cuffed Turner, clean, professional, and read him his rights. Turner's eyes flicked to Marcus with something like regret, then something flatter. The look of a man who had justified small betrayals as survival. Outside the room, a light flashed, the bystander live stream still running, the internet already making the scene louder. Lena's hand found Marcus's, having slipped into the precinct in the half-light between shock and action. Margaret stood a step behind her, eyes wet but steady. The empathetic narrator felt the tether that kept Marcus human, the faces who saw him beyond paperwork. Their presence steadied the moment into something that could be rebuilt. The climax did not explode so much as rearrange. The corrupt scheme's threads were exposed, the man who pulled them arrested, the fragile map of trust redrawn. The impartial facts lined up, logs, footage, payment trails, and closed the loop. The empathetic truth answered the deeper question. Systems could be bent, people could choose wrong, but small acts of observation, Ethan's replay, Bennett's refusal to accept neat answers, the bystander's shaky footage, could stitch the truth back together. Marcus sat back, wrists unclasped now from the cold of metal and the colder bite of accusation. The fluorescent light threw hard lines across his face. Outside, rain cut the city into silver. He had survived the immediate betrayal. But he knew the work of repair would be slow. He had a body of evidence, names turned into records, and a new, sharp awareness that trust, once given, could be used as a weapon. In the quiet after the reveal, Marcus breathed and let the room be what it was. Messy and human, flawed and necessary. He had been marked, exposed, and then, in that sudden cinematic pivot, acknowledged by people who could see the whole. The moral reckoning would come later, boards, hearings, exonerations. But here, under the harsh light, truth had been spoken aloud. The price of that truth would be paid in time, apologies, and the slow work of rebuilding faith. The precinct emptied the way a storm finally moves off the map, pieces of noise folding into quieter shapes. Papers were stamped, statements were taken, and the fluorescent lights hummed down to a low, ordinary buzz. Sergeant Collins wrote a report that would live in a file room. Agent Bennett collected the digital evidence and sent it up the chain. Ethan backed up the bystander stream to secure storage. The impartial work of paperwork and protocol began to turn the night into a record that could be read. The empathetic voice lingered on the small, human moments that paperwork cannot catch. Marcus walked out of the interview room with Lena at his side and Margaret behind her, both faces a mixture of shock and steady relief. He felt the weight of hours dissolve into something like exhaustion and gratitude all at once. The metal cold of the cuffs had given way to the softer grip of hands that belonged to people who loved him. Their touch was a quiet restoration. Officially, Paul Turner was charged with evidence tampering, filing false reports, and collusion with known suspects. Internal Affairs opened a formal investigation into the use of the burner line and the apparent payments traced to the diner kiosk. The district attorney's office requested the logs and the video. Other agencies put holds on certain operations pending review. The impartial narrative recorded the language of systems moving to contain the harm. In Marcus's chest, the night left a quiet, insistent ache. He had watched one of his own become the kind of enemy that felt like a betrayal of a family. Turner had used process as a weapon, and the damage spilled beyond the man into colleagues, cases, and trust. Marcus thought about the informants whose names might now be exposed, the operations that needed quiet, and the fragile ethics of a job where secrecy sometimes saved lives and sometimes hid mistakes. He felt the moral weight of both outcomes. Justice for himself, but a ripple that could harm others. Daniel came to the precinct office later. After the initial reports were filed, he found Marcus by the window, looking at the rain still clinging to the glass. "I'm sorry," he said, simply, the words stripped of ceremony. He did not offer the kind of apology that erases pain. He offered instead the small honesty of a man who had learned his limits. The impartial record would note a correction in procedure. Patrols were reminded to verify incoming federal requests through secure channels. A memo circulated about cross-jurisdictional checks. Training modules were scheduled. The department closed gaps where the burner call had slipped through. Those were fixes in systems, necessary, clinical, and slow. Marcus listened to Daniel and felt something shift. He accepted the apology not because it fixed the night, but because it opened a way for repair. Daniel had acted from a place of duty that had been manipulated. His remorse was real, shaped by the discomfort of seeing how his certainty had been used. They spoke, cautiously, about the thin places where law met people. Marcus did not pretend everything could go back to before. He knew better now how fragile the scaffolding of trust was, but he also understood that men who could change needed the space to do it. Outside, the city picked at the story like a wound that would scab over slowly. Some outlets would run the footage and tell the simpler version. A man in cuffs, a dramatic reveal. Others would dig and find the nuance, burner phones, a paid informant, a colleague who betrayed his oath. The impartial press would make headlines. The human story would only reveal itself in longer conversations and slow corrections. At home that night, Lena made tea and sat with Marcus while Margaret hummed something from an old hymn in the kitchen. The house smelled of lemon and kettle and the quiet comfort of small rituals. Marcus let himself be held, and in that holding he found a small, stubborn resolve. He could leave, walk away from an agency that let corruption live inside its rooms, or he could stay and try to change the parts that had failed him and might fail others. The empathetic narrator watched him choose. He thought of the people in the files whose safety relied on discretion, of the colleagues who were honest and tired and good, and of the work that still needed doing. He chose not out of naivete, but out of a measured belief that leaving would not mend the pattern Turner had exploited. Staying meant risk. It also meant the possibility of repair from the inside. Marcus decided to remain, with conditions: greater transparency in coordination, protections for those who could be framed, and a commitment from his superiors to review practices that allowed burner lines to speak with authority. In the weeks that followed, hearings would be scheduled, internal reviews carried out, and apologies both private and public would thread through rooms that smelled of coffee and old paper. Turner's trial would be messy and televised. Some friends would sidestep Marcus in awkward silence, and some would stand with him. Daniel would participate in a review board and volunteer for extra training on bias and verification. These steps, recorded in formal language, would begin the work of accountability. Yet the quietest work was not in reports or memos. It was in the small conversations Marcus had with Lena and Margaret, in the late calls to colleagues to ensure informant safety, in the moments he tested his own limits. He learned to ask for witnesses early, to insist on procedure that protected both secrecy and fairness. He learned that institutions could be both shelter and sieve, that the same systems that shielded people could be used to harm them. In the end, the resolution was neither clean nor entirely whole. Turner paid a price in law, policies were rewritten, Marcus's name was cleared in the files that counted. But the true measure was slower, a new caution in rooms where trust had once been given freely, a set of small reforms that made future abuses harder, and a commitment from Marcus to remain present in the work. He had been betrayed, and he had chosen to respond not with bitterness alone, but with careful action. Standing at the kitchen window months later, Marcus watched rain slide down glass and thought about maps of cities, of careers, of people. Trust, he realized, was a map he needed to redraw often. He would teach others to read the new map, and he would watch with tired vigilance for the small hands that might try to redraw it for selfish reasons. The moral was not tidy. Justice had been done in one room, and the long work of repair had begun in another. He breathed, let the air fill his chest, and walked back into the house where Lena waited, the lights soft and ordinary and stubbornly human. So, tell me, if you were in his shoes, mocked and underestimated, would you have revealed your success or walked away in silence? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that flip the script on arrogance.